Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello and welcome to another episode on the New Books Network. I'm one of your hosts, Dr. Miranda Melcher, and I'm very pleased today to be speaking with Dr. Rebecca Charbonneau about her book titled Mixed Signals, Alien Communication Across the Iron Curtain, published by Polity in late 2024 in the UK and in early 2025 in the US. This is a really interesting history, and we're going to talk about alien communication. We're going to talk about that with a lot of different meanings here, because yes, there is this idea of searching for extraterrestrial intelligence, something that both American and Soviet scientists were very involved in for quite a number of years. But there's also the whole Cold War aspect of this. What does science look like in that context? What does collaboration look like in that context? It's not just communication off of planet Earth that we have to discuss. So, Rebecca, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast.
Yes, thank you for having me.
Could you please start us off by introducing yourself a little bit and tell us why you decided to write this book?
Yeah, so I am a historian of science by training. I earned my PhD in history and philosophy of science from the University of Cambridge. And I have spent most of my career since then working in scientific institutions. I'm currently a historian at the American Institute of Physics. Prior to that, I worked at the National Radio Astronomy Observatory here in the United States, and also the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics. So I'm very much in the world of history of astronomy and physics. And I first became interested in writing this book actually while I was a master's student at the University of Oxford. And I came across this book titled Intelligent Life in the Universe, which is an out-of-print book. It was published in 1966, and it was co-authored by an American astronomer, Carl Sagan, and a Soviet astrophysicist, Josip Shklovsky. And the book is on the subject of seeking out and communicating with extraterrestrial intelligence, out there in the universe. And I just thought it was the strangest book in the world, not only because of its contents, but also because it was written as a dialogue between Carl Sagan and Josip Shklovsky, a Soviet and American, both involved in their respective space races. During 1966, kind of the height of the space race, some of the height of Cold War tensions. And I thought that it was a very weird book, and I wanted to understand how it could possibly have been written. And in investigating that question, it took me down a rabbit hole of the networks of cooperation between Soviet and American astronomers as they tried to seek out extraterrestrials during the Cold War period.
I always love a good history book that starts with encountering something unexpected and going, hang on a second, what is happening here? And then following that thread through, all of the research that it takes to make an actual book, of which this is obviously a fabulous example of that investigation. And part of what you discuss in the book, especially early on, is not just kind of this question you started off with of how did this particular Sagan book come to be, but this wider sort of ecosystem that this is happening in, and also how that history of radio astronomy has been written about already, because that's kind of part of this that's interesting too, is not just what was being done in terms of science, but like how people were thinking about what was happening and thought about it afterwards. Mm-hmm. So can you tell us a bit about that, this history of radio astronomy, this history of SETI, and how this isn't just a question of sort of scientific progress of this paper and that discovery? Like this is related to broader Cold War history, isn't it?
Absolutely it is. And I discovered it. It's funny to talk about it being an investigation. I very much felt like a little detective as I was writing this book, because there are so many factors at play here. There is, the standard narrative of the history of science and technology during the Cold War, right? And radio astronomy is a fantastic example of that, because it is a science that really grew directly out of World War II and into the Cold War environment. And so there's that standard history, which is a very rich and fascinating history. And then there's also the history of the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, which developed right along the same time. Then there's the histories of communication, of radio communication, and how, why radio as the mechanism for communicating with other worlds? Well, it's the mechanism we use here on Earth. So there's a great tie to the histories of our own styles of communication, our own technologies for communications. And then there's this added layer, which I think is what makes SETI so particularly fascinating in examining the history of the Cold War, is that you have these scientists who are working on a scientific problem, but they're also very much working on a cultural problem. Because in order to make contact, to communicate with extraterrestrial intelligence, you have to ask yourself all sorts of cultural, social questions. Like, what is a civilization? What is life? What is the nature of communication? What are the ethics involved in communicating with other worlds? Should we send messages? Is there a democratic impetus in all of this? Does everybody on Earth have the right to speak on behalf of the planet? And so it's interesting to see a group of physical scientists. They don't have training in linguistics or sociology or backgrounds in history, but they're wrestling with these questions that are very embedded in the history of our world. And they're doing so at a point in history during the Cold War where a lot of these questions are being worked out here on Earth. Like, what does it mean to be a democratic nation? What is the best way to structure a society? How do societies evolve over time? And so it's, in some ways, when you study SETI, you're not just looking at a scientific question. You're looking at how scientific-minded people are wrestling with a moment in time.
Very fun to look at as a historian then. Thank you for laying out that kind of scope and contributions of this, as you said, investigation. Before we go forward, though, for those of us who are not as involved in these details as you are, what is SETI?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a more complicated question than you might imagine. So put very simply, the most common definition of SETI is spelled SETI, which is Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. This is the phrase that's probably most familiar to people. They might have heard of the SETI Institute in California. They might think of movies like Contact, starring Jodie Foster, with SETI scientists. But my book focuses on a slightly different interpretation of the term SETI, in that I'm really looking at SETI with a C, as I sometimes call it, which is CETI, standing for Communication with Extraterrestrial Intelligence. And this is describing kind of the early days of our efforts to communicate or contact extraterrestrials using radio astronomy infrastructure. And nowadays, again, that's called SETI with an S, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. But when the science first developed, and it developed in the late 1950s, early 1960s, again, right at the start of this Cold War period, the common term was really SETI with a C. The impetus was on communication. And I found this particularly interesting as a historian, because the scientists are looking specifically at the idea of communication. That's where they really get mired down in all of these social cultural issues, which I think makes SETI with a C a science that is particularly linked to the Cold War in a way that maybe modern SETI with an S is not so much closely linked.
Okay, this is very helpful to understand, and I think we should clarify from now on. We're pretty much all going to be talking with SETI with a C, unless we say otherwise. So we've got that as a nice foundation there. Let's talk then more about, as you said, these physical scientists not trained in linguistics or sociology, but trying to grapple with a lot of these questions. To what extent were these SETI scientists or radio astronomers more broadly in this Cold War context? Were they military scientists?
What a good question, and it's not an easy question to answer. So it's important to understand first that most of these astronomers were radio astronomers. And radio astronomy was a little bit of a weird field in that it pretty much was non-existent until right at the end of World War II. Because what happened during World War II is the development of radar. And radar is kind of and radar equipment is a bit of an early predecessor to radio astronomy infrastructure. And what happened is that during World War II, we had the development of what President Eisenhower later called the development of the military-industrial complex. Scientists from universities and research institutes were called into the war effort, and they served as radio engineers and technicians. They worked as radar operators during the war. And then what happened was, at the end of the war, there was all of this now defunct or not highly used equipment, radar equipment, and they were sometimes given permission to bring that equipment back to their universities and use it for scientific purposes. This is actually what happened in the case of Britain's Jodrell Bank Observatory. The then director, Sir Bernard Lovell, had been a radar operator for the Royal Air Force, the RAF, And he, when he was doing his radar operations, he believed that he was seeing evidence of cosmic rays on his radar equipment. And he was a cosmic ray physicist. So this was very exciting to him. Now, it turns out that he wasn't actually seeing cosmic rays. He was observing meteors coming through the atmosphere and ionizing the atmosphere around them. And that was being picked up by the radar equipment. But, this was the beginning of the creation of Jodrell Bank Observatory. This, former military officer going back to his university using military equipment, but to answer a scientific question. So was he a military scientist? Not necessarily. He had ties to the military. He was using military equipment, but he was asking pure science questions and using that equipment to try to answer those questions. But it gets muddied because what happened next was Sir Bernard Lovell decided that he would pursue this new branch of physics, of radio astronomy, and started to establish one of the first major radio astronomy observatories in the world by building, using both public funds and funds from the University of Manchester to build a large steerable radio dish. We call this the Lovell telescope now. And right as it was being finished in 1957, he got into quite a bit of trouble because he had misappropriated some of these funds. The telescope had gone way over budget, and he was being investigated potentially for fraud. He may have gone to jail for going, what is today, millions and millions of pounds over budget, of public funds. But then something interesting happened in 1957. The satellite Sputnik was launched, and it turned out that there was almost nowhere in the Western world that had the capability to track not the Sputnik satellite, but critically the staged rocket that helped to launch it. And this was very, very critical at the start of the Cold War period, because a staged rocket, a rocket that could put something in orbit, could later be used for nuclear missile capabilities, right? And so it was really critical for Western countries to be able to track that rocket. And all of a sudden, Sir Bernard Lovell and his telescope were really one of the only facilities in the Western world that could do this. So he was saved from, his fraud accusations. And Jodrell Bank suddenly had a really critical global defense role. And so this is what makes it difficult to pin radio astronomy infrastructure or radio astronomers as either military scientists or not. Because the reality is that most radio astronomers were simply astronomers. They were curious about the universe. They wanted to understand, how our universe works. They wanted to make observations. They weren't particularly interested in the military or global conflict. But their science emerged from the military. It was used in the early Cold War period as a key part of military infrastructure. And so this really blurs the line between, military and scientific function for these scientists.
Yeah, that's definitely a very easy question for me to ask, but a much, much more complicated and therefore much more interesting answer. So thank you for helping us kind of understand the blurriness that we need to keep in mind as we think about kind of what these scientists are doing. And of course, one of the things that they're doing is they're scientists. They're publishing academic papers, right? Scientific papers. And they look pretty similar in a lot of ways to the sorts of papers that we have now. There's a title. And of course, there's authorship. And there's discussions of attribution, which still can be a pretty fraught topic with research today. But can you tell us about why looking at this history of attributions when it comes to things like discoveries like papers in radio astronomy is actually quite a good place to look at some of these things we've been talking about in terms of Cold War tensions, in terms of kind of who this information is for?
Absolutely. So we're all pretty familiar with the standard narratives of the kind of scientific technical competition between the Soviet Union and the United States. We all also know that the Soviet Union was generally considered a closed nation during the Cold War, right? That's why Winston Churchill used that term, the Iron Curtain that had fallen across Europe. There was famously not great communication between the countries, and when there was communication, it was often hostile, right? And yet, scientists, especially astronomers, really rely on global communication and cooperation to do their work. There's a number of reasons why this is the case, but the most simply put is that the Earth turns, right? And so you can never look at one spot on the sky continually from one place. You must rely on your colleagues in other countries on the other side of the world if you're interested in studying things like transient astronomical objects, or if you want to maintain a continuous observation of a source. And so this presents a problem in that the United States and the Soviet Union are, virtually on other sides of the world from one another. And so it really behooves the scientists in the respective countries to want to work with one another. And yet they can't many times because of these barriers, these political barriers that have been put in place. And this made it difficult, oftentimes, not only for them to communicate effectively and cooperate, but also for them to even push the science forward together, because they wouldn't know who had accomplished what and when. Part of the problem was that journals, you just mentioned kind of scientists publishing in journals. This is very standard practice then, as it is now. But journals were not always translated or shared freely between the Soviet Union and the United States. And even when they were sometimes censored if they had to do with, space science specifically during the space race and the Cold War period. And so this made it very, very difficult for these scientists to cooperate with one another and to credit one another. So when you look at the history of radio astronomy during the Cold War, you see many, many examples of scientists basically having to do the same work over again. A scientist in the West, is able to calculate the transition of neutral hydrogen. And a Soviet scientist hears that they might have done that, but in fact does not have access to the paper, and so has to do it himself. And so in that case, you kind of end up having these dual firsts, where who really did it first. You also get cases where some people make claims, and those claims have already been debunked in the United States, but there was no means to communicate that. And so the history of attribution is a great way to look at not only the challenges that Soviet and American scientists faced in working with one another, but really critically looking at how communication here on Earth was really fraught during the Cold War period, which is why it's so fascinating to study SETI specifically, because it is a science that really purports fundamentally to be about communication across great barriers, be they the barrier of outer space or, as we see in the book, simply barriers in scientific communication amongst colleagues.
Speaking of that, differences between colleagues, can you tell us a bit more about the differences between US SETI and Soviet SETI?
Yeah, absolutely. So SETI is generally credited as having started with what's called Project Ozma in the United States. That's what is, again, generally considered to be the kind of the first case of someone conducting a SETI observation. It was done by Frank Drake in April 1960 at the U.S. National Radio Astronomy Observatory in Green Bank, West Virginia. And he looked at two stars, Epsilon Eridani and Tau Ceti. And it was an inconclusive and null result. No detection of extraterrestrials was made. But this is the search that the search heard around the world, for lack of a better phrase. And Project Ozma was made a very large impact in the Soviet Union. And in particular with one man, the previously mentioned Josip Shklovsky. And that is because Frank Drake searched for extraterrestrial intelligence on the hydrogen line. I just mentioned that earlier, the 21-centimeter hydrogen line. And it just so happens that Josip Shklovsky was that person in the Soviet Union who independently calculated it when he was not able to access the papers by Western scientists. And because Drake used the 21-centimeter hydrogen line for such an interesting purpose, it really inspired Shklovsky, who he felt very fond about having, calculated this line. And now it was being used for this really, really fascinating function. And so he ended up authoring a book called Universe, Life, Mind, which is kind of the first Soviet SETI book. And you can see a couple of key differences in what would eventually develop to be Soviet SETI versus what was starting to grow after Project Ozma in the United States. The first one being that in the United States, SETI was not taken very seriously initially, like a lot of space sciences weren't in their early days, possibly because of its ties to science fiction. People, when they think about extraterrestrials, think about maybe War of the Worlds. And so it was not, it was very difficult for American scientists to get funding for searches. In the Soviet Union, on the other hand, because of the centralized nature of their scientific agencies, because someone like Josip Shklovsky, who was the head of a scientific institution in the Soviet Union, and who led an astronomy department in Moscow. He was able to kind of launch more searches and more observations than his American colleagues were able to. This was a good thing, but it also had some problems because they of course were not subject to the same kind of rigorous peer review that we would see in the United States. So that's the major difference between Soviet and American SETI. But of course, there also are differences in how the respective scientists viewed what kind of civilizations they would find. It's perhaps not surprising in hindsight to think that Soviet scientists imagined a sort of Soviet style of civilizations existing in the universe, because the Soviet culture, the Soviet government, was aspiring to be a sort of space-based technological superpower that was going to bring upon communism in Earth and perhaps even into the stars. And so the Soviets, SETI scientists would imagine these large universal civilizations that spread all throughout the galaxy, that of course had communist attributes. Whereas the United States had, again, a little bit more of an American style imaginings of what a life in the universe might look like.
Okay, this is very helpful to understand and really interesting to kind of think about similar starting points ending up in kind of different ways. But in fact, thinking of the similar starting points, you mentioned earlier that a lot of this, one of the reasons why the question of are they military scientists is relevant is because at least some of this is coming out of World War II. But the US and the Soviets aren't the only ones fighting World War II. They're not the only ones doing all sorts of science around World War II. So why is it kind of only the US and the Soviet Union that are doing this sort of SETI stuff from the 1950s onwards?
Absolutely. This is one of the central questions that I was trying to figure out as I was writing my book. Because it's not clear, right? Because it's easy to think, well, yes, of course, in the United States, of course, in the Soviet Union, because these were countries that were involved in World War II, that were involved in radar research and infrastructure building. They developed radio astronomy facilities. And so once you have all of that, you think, well, of course, it's just a leap to think that they might be interested in using those tools to search for extraterrestrial intelligence. But you could say the exact same thing of Britain. And in fact, you could say maybe even more of the case in Britain, right? Because Britain actually really dominated radio astronomy in its first decade. But Britain just simply was not as interested in SETI in those early days. And so this was a big point of curiosity for me, as why the Soviet Union and why the United States. And I came to a couple of different conclusions. Some of them are simple, which is to say that, the Soviet Union and the United States were in a scientific technical competition with one another. And, to be the first nation to make contact with extraterrestrial intelligence, well, that would be pretty significant, right, in their general race to space, in their pursuit of being, the dominant civilization here on Earth. But then I think there's more to it than that. I think there was a rich tradition of science fiction in both countries, the United States and the Soviet Union, and prior to that, Russia, had rich traditions in sci-fi, and I think that did influence the scientists involved. And then I think critically, it really had to do with the idea that where do technological civilizations progress? The United States and the Soviet Union, more than any other country on the planet at this time period, were really thinking of the future. They were thinking of, what will the world look like if the United States was in charge of shaping what that world looked like, or the Soviet Union was in charge of shaping what that looked like. It was an ideological battle, but it was a battle for the future, critically. And I think if you just have that big picture thinking about what does it mean to be a successful civilization that will go on to be spacefaring, that will go on to exist for centuries, millennia, what does that look like? And I think just thinking along those lines, asking those questions is what prompted a lot of scientists to think about civilizations that might have already gone through that might be existing out there in the universe. And critically, I think it is because of the nuclear threat, that arms race between the Soviet Union and the United States, that really prompted the question of how do civilizations not only shape themselves, but how do they survive? do technological civilizations ultimately destroy themselves? Is if they don't, maybe there's someone out there who's survived all of this that we're going through right now, and they may have the answers to that question. So I think it really is those existential questions that scientists in the Soviet Union and the United States were facing that really fostered that fascination with the idea of being able to communicate with extraterrestrial intelligence.
Okay, so the existential element of this definitely is shared, but isn't just one about kind of fascination only in the good sense, right? If we're talking about nuclear stuff, we're talking about existential fear.
Absolutely.
And we're also talking about civilizational hope, is that right?
Absolutely. SETI is really marked by that juxtaposition between fear and hope. The kind of the utopianism you see in the 1960s with the development of, well, in the 50s and 60s, Walt Disney's Tomorrowland, and this kind of fervent idea that technology is going to usher in a utopian future, and that it's going to change our lives, and our civilization will be unrecognizable in a very positive way. But at the same time, technology, threatening to destroy not just, our culture, but our entire world. That was a new concern, right? It's not about the fall of Rome. It's about the fall of everybody, about total nuclear annihilation, right? And this is a new fear in the history of humanity. And it really, really shaped, not only scientists, but really everybody living on Earth at that time, but especially in the Soviet Union and the United States, where actors had a role to shape the outcome of our civilization. And scientists had a particular role and influence during this time. So it was a very heavy question weighing on the minds of radio astronomers, especially, again, as we know, their infrastructure was used for nuclear warfare and defense purposes. And you can tell that it imbued their thinking, not just from speculation, but you can see it appear in their work. So take Frank Drake, for example, who I just mentioned is conducting Project Ozma, what's generally considered to be the first search for extraterrestrial intelligence in the modern era. And he, shortly after he conducted this search, held a meeting in 1961 in Green Bank, West Virginia, at the National Radio Astronomy Observatory. And at this meeting, it was just a small group of people, including, Nobel Prize winners like Melvin Calvin, but also people like a very young Carl Sagan. And he posited what's now known as the Drake equation, which is a series of variables, including things like the rate of star formation, the fraction of planets that have environments that are suitable to life, things along those lines. And the idea is that you could use this equation to help determine how many, extraterrestrial civilizations might currently exist in our galaxy. And tellingly, the final variable in his equation was L, which stood for the longevity of civilizations. He was very mindful in 1961, right? This is the year right before the world would come almost to destruction with the Cuban Missile Crisis. This is a moment in time where scientists like Frank Drake are aware that technological civilizations might be at risk of destroying themselves. And so the question isn't simply about, is the universe suitable for life, and how often does life develop? But critically, how long does life survive? Does intelligence inherently come along with its own destruction? This is a very Cold War question, and it imbued so much of the early development of SETI.
Very Cold War. Very, very Cold War.
Very Cold War.
Yeah, really interesting to think about. Is this then what explains that Sagan book, the weird cooperation across the Iron Curtain, even in the midst, obviously, of the barriers between them?
Absolutely, it does. And so Carl Sagan is a fantastic figure to look at when asking these questions, because as we now know later, in the 1980s, he would develop the concept of like the nuclear winter. He became a fervent anti-nuclear activist. Even a young Carl Sagan was very concerned about, the well-being of Earthlings. He was concerned a little bit less about the nationalist context, but really about people on the planet. And so even when he attended that meeting in 1961, he was very young. He was, I think, about 28 years old, and he was a postdoc at the University of California, Berkeley. And he became very, very interested in working with his Soviet colleagues. He held a real belief in scientific internationalism, in this idea that Science should ideally operate beyond borders, that it should be apolitical, even in a time where science was objectively incredibly political. He strove towards this philosophy of a apolitical cooperative science. And so he made great efforts to reach out to his colleagues in the Soviet Union. And one of the first he did so was Joseph Shklovsky. And that's how that book got written. He wrote a letter to Shklovsky, and he had heard of Shklovsky's book, which had been published, Universe Life Mind, in 1962, and asked Shklovsky if it would be possible to get it published, translated into English, and published in the United States. Again, part of this idea that we should be sharing ideas across the Iron Curtain and communicating with one another. And Joseph Shklovsky very happily agreed and actually invited Sagan to contribute a little bit to the book because due to Lysenkoism and issues with access to biology texts in the Soviet Union, Shklovsky felt that the sections on astrobiology, the development of life in the universe, were kind of weak in his book, and he thought Sagan would be well positioned to addend the book to include more of those materials. Now, Sagan took his invitation very broadly and ended up adding so much to the book that it about doubled in size. And so when he sent the English translation back to Shklovsky in the Soviet Union, the front cover now said, by Carl Sagan and Joseph Shklovsky, which always cracks me up because I think, can you imagine being in your late 20s, a postdoc, and here's this very preeminent Soviet professor, and you offer to translate his book and then add yourself as an author without his knowledge. It's just a very cheeky thing to do. But it ended up working out perfectly fine because Shklovsky was also a very open-minded person who was very passionate about astronomy, about doing good science beyond political borders, and he welcomed Sagan's contributions and the ability to reach a larger audience, and their friendship that arose out of the writing of this book is part of what was able to foster so many collaborations, visits, and meetings across the U.S.-Soviet divide during the Cold War period. And so it really was, again, just this desire for friendship and cooperation and communication that prompted what was truly a very successful cooperative endeavor during a period where it was difficult to do that for a number of reasons.
Given that this was, as you said, a difficult period to do this, obviously the Cold War is not sort of everything was the same the whole time, right? There were periods where it was more tense. There were periods where it was less tense. So this sort of cooperation across the Iron Curtain, was this something that changed over time as well?
Absolutely, it did. There were definitely periods where it was harder, and periods, in fact, where it was almost impossible. Joseph Shklovsky, for example, was frequently throughout his career banned from traveling abroad for political reasons. For example, he once wrote a letter in support of the Andrei Sakharov, who was the kind of the father of the Soviet thermonuclear bomb, but later became a fervent anti-nuclear activist and was exiled in the Soviet Union. Shklovsky wrote a letter in support of him, and that caused him to be barred from traveling abroad and working with his American colleagues. Similarly, there were periods where there was hostility growing between the Soviet Union and the United States that made, for example, hosting international scientific visits impossible. But then there were periods, right, like détente, where it became a lot more easy for scientists to organize, say cross-border scientific conferences. But there was also a little bit of a nuance to this, which is that sometimes hosting scientific meetings, even if the countries were feeling hostile to one another, benefited the political and national interests of the countries. For example, we know that in the 1960s, early 1960s, even though that was a period of hostility between the Soviet Union and the United States, there were a number of scientific exchange programs hosted by the respective scientific academies in the United States and the Soviet Union, and also in Britain. And partly this was because by having scientists visit the facilities of the other country, you were able to get kind of human intelligence. A scientist would go visit their colleagues in the Soviet Union, and then they would be expected to write reports upon return, where they were essentially sharing what they saw and learned and heard. And so sometimes cooperation served that kind of that dual role of genuinely fostering scientific cooperation and friendship, but also serving in the national interests of their respective nations, and that they were able to gather intelligence, which, as we know in the history of the Cold War, intelligence gathering was one of the major stages that the Cold War played out on.
Yeah, definitely a really key feature of this. So interesting to understand kind of how this SETI radio astronomy piece fits in. Given, in fact, that focus, obviously intelligence is one part of it. Cold War, the war piece also hints at the fact that there's a lot of nationalism going on here. There's a lot of paternalism as well, especially if we're talking about kind of communication and who's getting talked to in what sorts of ways. Obviously, we talk about this a lot in terms of the Cold War, convincing countries in Africa to side with one side or the other. Do we also see these things showing up in SETI as well?
100% we do. And that is going back to the feature of SETI that I was discussing earlier about, really highlighting some of these scientists' cultural and social views, even if they were not totally cognizant of them. Because what they were ultimately trying to do, a lot of the scientists were interested in creating messaging, for example, messaging extraterrestrial intelligence, be it through radio signals or through artifacts we put on spacecraft that they were launching during the Cold War and space race period. And these scientists were striving to create universal messages. They wanted to create, a message that reflected all of Earth, all of humanity. But the reality is that if you look at who was conducting, science, radio astronomy specifically, during the 1960s, the early 1970s, overwhelmingly it's Soviet American white men. And because of that, there is a very particular viewpoint or perspective that's being prioritized in these messages, albeit their efforts to strive towards universality. And this is actually, for a historian, deeply fascinating. Because what happens then is that these universal message ends up being artifacts of a very specific moment in time, a very specific demographic, and it gives you a view into how they viewed our world in that broad sense. But of course, the reality is that there's a lot of perspective missing. I studied this in the Pioneer probe, which was launched in the early 1970s. It had a plaque designed by Carl Sagan and Frank Drake on it. That included an image of a man and a woman. And Carl Sagan actually worked with his then wife, Linda Salzman Sagan, to create that image. And they tried as best they could to make it look with how they described panracial, so not making it look like it is a white person or a black person or what have you. And of course, they wanted to include a man and a woman. But nevertheless, if you study the image, they clearly modeled it after Greek statuary. You can see that in the proportions. They're standing in contrapposto. And so therefore, I think are probably read white by many viewers. But perhaps more importantly, the female figure is standing passively, arms at her side, and the male figure is waving hello in greeting, taking a more active role. And while the male has his genitalia fully depicted in the image, the female genitalia is kind of conspicuously missing. Carl Sagan later explained this by saying that he was very concerned that NASA wouldn't allow them to launch the message because there is that taboo around female genitalia, and they didn't want it to be kind of censored or stopped by NASA. But that's an interesting case study to show how SETI scientists' perceptions of the biases and taboos of their culture affected the universal representation on the messages that they were sending. And so we can see there, like, kind of the passive role of women during that time period being portrayed on the plaque. And so, again, were they creating truly universal messages? No, of course they weren't. It was not a time in Earth history or U.S. history where there was a large kind of democratic representation in the sciences. But from a historical perspective, it's fascinating because it allows us to kind of unpack all of these cultural and social threads that were woven together during the Cold War period just by looking at the artifacts of what they were crafting.
Speaking of the kind of social and cultural environment in which this was all happening, I wonder if we can do a bit of explaining, I suppose, the changes between then and now, because we started this conversation with one of the foundational pieces was explaining what is SETI, right? And you clarified for us that what we know today, SETI with an S, isn't the same thing as you've been talking about SETI with a C. So what happened? What led to the decline of SETI with a C and the rise of SETI with an S?
Yeah, absolutely. So there is some continuation, right? Frank Drake's equation is still very popular in SETI, but I do see a very marked departure that happens in the 1990s from SETI with a C into what we now know as SETI with an S. And there's a number of reasons why this is the case. For one, there is just the end of the Cold War and the fall of the Soviet Union. With the fall of the Soviet Union, many of the scientists who were involved in SETI were no longer able to pursue that work. So that is one clear indicator that type of SETI was coming to an end. There is also in the United States a major shift in that SETI really starts becoming under fire from U.S. Government. It faces a lot of challenges in Congress. Many SETI projects get defunded by the U.S. government. It's actually banned by NASA as something NASA will fund. And because of that, SETI then goes, the SETI scientists in the United States start pursuing private funding. This is when you see the creation of the SETI Institute. You start seeing SETI scientists like Jill Tarter and Carl Sagan pursue funding from multimillionaires and billionaires, something that is still true of SETI today. For example, the largest SETI initiative today is Breakthrough Listen, which is funded by a billionaire, an Israeli-Russian billionaire who lives in the United States. And so that's a marked shift, right, from the kind of Cold War U.S. government R&D efforts to now a very private source of funding. And then I also think that there is also just a little bit of a cultural shift. I think there is a cultural fatigue, even though there was not, as I mentioned, a ton of observational SETI in the United States during the Cold War period. There's a sense of time has been passing and we have not detected extraterrestrial intelligence. Maybe this is not something that will be successful. So I think there's a little bit of fatigue. And then I think critically, there also, SETI was very tied, I think, as I mentioned, to kind of the intelligence community. And I haven't really touched on this yet, but partly that's because SETI was very adept at developing kind of tools and techniques that could detect artificial signals in space, right? They're looking for these artificial messages from extraterrestrials. But it turns, during the Cold War period, the intelligence community, especially the signals intelligence community, was also very interested in developing tools and techniques to detect artificial signals in space, right? Whether they are from, spy satellites or deep space data links. So there was a little bit of an overlap, and you do see evidence during the Cold War period of the intelligence community co-opting SETI technology in order to pursue intelligence targets. And so what happens at the end of the Cold War? Well, for one thing, signals intelligence decreases a little bit. It's not as an important feature of global security because of the fall of the Soviet Union. But also there's the rise of the internet, of computers. And suddenly computer surveillance, that becomes a much more critical area for intelligence, as it still is today, cybersecurity. So all of these various factors that were, all tangled together during the Cold War period really start to come undone at the turn of the century, of the millennium. And that's why I think, SETI with a C really was a feature of the Cold War. And while, of course, modern SETI today still carries some of the features of its origins, it really is a markedly different field and science than it was when it first started.
Just really interesting to think about, given, so many other types of science and research are not necessarily that different or kind of building on things. To think about the transformation over not that much time is really interesting to understand. But that's, of course, only one thing that readers could take away from this. We've talked about a lot of different things here. So is there sort of a particular imagined audience you have when you wrote this book, or key things you really hope people take away from it?
Yeah, it's great. So I kind of imagined talking to 3 different audiences in my book, which is ambitious. I think that's not usually advised when people are writing books. But I really wanted to talk to 3 groups in particular. Of course, the first group would be my colleagues, people in the history of science. SETI has not been a field that has been highly studied in the history of science. There are very, very few people who have ever looked at it in great detail. And the Soviet side has been almost entirely ignored. And so partly I'm talking to historians and historians of science to get them to take SETI seriously. because it is, as we've discussed, a really, really fantastic lens, not only into the field itself, which is fascinating, but into understanding a lot of the features of science, technology, and culture during the Cold War period. But then, of course, I'm also talking to scientists, astronomers in particular. I imagine speaking both to SETI scientists because I'd like them to appreciate the origins of their field, especially, again, the Soviet side really disappeared. Not entirely, but it faded in the 1990s. And a lot of American SETI scientists today are not very aware of the Soviet contributions, and I'd like them to appreciate it. And I'd also like them to think a little bit more critically about the history of their field, about how culture and history affects the character of their ideas. And perhaps being aware of that will help them, be more cognizant of the choices they make as they are pursuing this work, and perhaps make their work even more successful. Because if we're aware of our biases, it might help us eliminate at least some of them. And also, just astronomers in general, sometimes astronomers do not take SETI very seriously as a science. Some of them might even consider it a pseudoscience. And I hope that by reading this book, they see that SETI really is baked in to the history of radio astronomy. And, there is no history of radio astronomy without history of SETI. They are so interconnected. And I'd like them to perhaps gain a new appreciation for an underappreciated subfield. Those are the main things. And of course, for the general reader, I hope they just get to learn an interesting bit of Cold War history. I'd like them to think a little bit more deeply about what it means to communicate with the other, whether that be the other in outer space or those who are alien to you here on Earth, and perhaps come away with both a sense of hope and a sense of concern about how difficult it really is, and it can be, to communicate even with those who are very, very like you.
Lots to think about there. Thank you very much for kind of that overview, a useful place, I think, to conclude our discussion about the book. But I do have one last question for the interview. What are you working on now that the book is done?
So I mentioned I recently got this position at the American Institute of Physics, which is just fantastic, and I'm really enjoying it. In terms of next book projects, I'm working on a history of post-detection protocols. So in sort of towards the end of the Cold War period, SETI scientists became aware that because of the barriers to communication between their two countries, it might be nice to have some sort of international agreement on what to do if you do make successful contact or detection of an extraterrestrial intelligence. And so they started forming protocols for what to do. And this is a very exciting little bit of history of scientific diplomacy. And also, again, such a huge challenge for these people who have backgrounds in the physical sciences, suddenly now taking on international politics, science policy, philosophy and ethics of democracy. So I will be turning my eye to the late Cold War period and writing about the unfolding of these protocols and all the challenges that came about in trying to create them.
That sounds intriguing. Thank you for the sneak peek, and best of luck with that project. And of course, while you work on it, listeners can read the book we've been discussing, titled Mixed Signals, Alien Communication Across the Iron Curtain, published by Polity in late 2024 in the UK and out in the US in early 2025. Rebecca, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast.
Of course, thank you so much for having me.